Next, I want to introduce Dr. Ginger Orton. Dr. Ginger Orton is a social scientist and agricultural communicator with a focus on producer engagement, climate smart practice integration. In June, she will begin as Assistant Outreach Professor of Natural Resource at Science Communication at the University of Georgia. Her research includes audience analysis and experimental message testing to inform evidence-based outreach. Ginger and her husband run her family's beef operation in Georgia as well.
Well, good morning, everyone. I'll echo the major appreciation I have for being here. As Joe mentioned, I am about to begin as an assistant professor at the University of Georgia, and I'm just wrapping up a postdoc, also at the University of Georgia, and I've followed the science communication of the CLEAR Center since I graduated from my undergraduate program, so I'm hugely appreciative of the opportunity to be here with y'all and share a little bit from the social scientist perspective on this awesome panel on science communication in this space here. So gonna kind of paint a big picture, lay the landscape of the social scenario around climate mitigation strategies in the United States. Gonna kind of jump between producer engagement and public engagement, and just showcase broadly some of the work that we've been up to. So a little bit about my background here, just hitting on the research and outreach sides. Joe did a good job of introducing all of our work, but want to call attention to the role of change agents in this scenario. All of you are change agents in this room. We work closely with extension agents, with communication practitioners, all forms of science communicators, and the role they play in eliciting behavior change through knowledge transfer and information networks. We mentioned, you can see some of the background there. We heard great, and we'll hear more about experimental message testing, which I'm a huge advocate for in this evidence-based messaging recommendation space. But we'll spend most of my time talking about audience segmentation and audience analysis. And then there's just a couple of the organizations that have partnered with us at the university to provide this evidence-based outreach guidance. As scientists, we're all eager to make data-driven decisions, and so this is kind of our role in that as social scientists. And so this is going to be half advocating for the social sciences and half of a little take on our science here. And I've often been met with the idea that this is common sense. And to that I say, absolutely. And so maybe take this as an opportunity to make space for these conversations, to maybe get re-energized around this idea of our role as science communicators and knowing our audience. When I work with undergrads, I say on day one, there is no such thing as the general public. We really have to narrow in on this idea of target audiences, and we'll see that come to life a bit today. But then we go kind of beyond the demographic. We're past the time of 20-year-old females living in New York City as a target audience and getting into what we call the psychographic characteristics. So this kind of cognitive preconditions that we all have and we bring to the decision-making table. And as scientists, how we can measure, parcel those out, predict them, and then also influence them with this targeted outreach. And so we'll talk a little bit about theory. And this four-way circle I have here is my hilariously pithy attempt to summarize some of the major players in this psychographic space. We talk about values. We'll see that come to life in some of this audience segmentation work. But values kind of can be described as our moral compass, our guiding principles, our ideal version of ourself, and how we make decisions to kind of actualize that ideal version. In the producer-facing literature, we call this the good farmer theory, or how do we enact best practices to what we imagine as an ideal producer. And we do the same thing as consumers. And then I'm gonna get to issue perceptions last and kind of keep an eye on my time. I have some slides after this. I'll just say briefly about trust that we could fill 3 days with conversations on trust building. It's easy. I'll just kind of say simply that it takes a long, long time to build and a moment to destroy. Trust is, we call it a cognitive roadblock. If I'm receiving sound, relevant, the best science communication in the world from an untrusted source, I will not be processing that information. I'm from Georgia. I might be looking at you and smiling agreeing and nodding my head, but my cognitive internal dialogue is that this is total bullshit. And so we can be both, right? That we're processing. Trust is a major player in this space. And then we talk about educating. In the climate, I'm going to talk some about the social landscape around climate change and climate change science, but everyone has some idea when you say climate change, it elicits all of these cognitive connections on how we've heard about climate change before. We've talked about producers kind of being on the defensive, having a black eye in this space. So even the simple mention of the word climate elicits all of these responses. And so I say that to say that educating is important and we need to continue doing that, but it's about moving, for my work specifically, moving beyond education and moving into motivation. We'll look at some theoretical constructs here that really help us parcel out the difference between an information deficit and taking someone and nudging them, as we'll hear about more, toward behavior change. And then issue perceptions in this space are critically important. I'll zone in on kind of the producer audiences here, as we've all been talking about, that climate can elicit these really triggering responses. As a social scientist, I measure and am allowed to say about the political polarization around climate in the United States, about the tendency of producers to be on the defensive in this space, and then zoning in really specifically on this mitigation space versus other behaviors that may be more related to adaptation. And so mitigation is tricky in an American context because the literature tells us that most producers would agree that, and this is ag producers broadly, but particularly beef producers, dairy is in a slightly different ballgame that I'm discussing here, is that most producers will say things like, I've seen weather patterns change. The drought has been unprecedented in my area. But the missing key in the understanding or in their predisposition and their belief is in this anthropogenic nature, this idea that it is human caused, that it's not due to human activity, but is instead due to natural variations in the Earth's climate, that the pendulum would swing. And so the logic tracks that if we don't believe that climate change is human caused, then how could it be human remedied? And so we see a lot more uptake of adaptation, more reactive behaviors, rather than these mitigatory preventative behaviors, which is just the reality we have to reckon with in the United States around this space here. And so this is just a quick visual of what audience segmentation looks like. We can't be reduced to simple apples and oranges, but it's a good visual of parceling out one audience and teasing out our desired target audience, which I'll quickly bring to life here. I want to just throw up a couple of theories that we primarily use in this space. We've been talking about adoption this morning, the diffusion of innovations, these independent variables that are posited to influence our dependent variable of adoption or intention to adopt, and particularly looking at this scale here. This is the innovation adoption flow of how technologies are adopted in communities. And it's important to remember, especially with my producer-facing work, this is a major limitation of a lot of the work we do, no matter what role we play in this conversation, is that we're often working with these innovators and these early adopters. But we have a ton of potential in what we call, and we'll see come as this movable middle here. And then we talk about the smaller groups being on the end here, those early adopters and those laggards. When we talk about resources, we really want to be focusing on this middle group. And then here's another theory. I'm going to kind of breeze through it for the sake of time. But these are just a couple of examples of the cognitive constructs that we're trying to parcel out. We heard yesterday, and again, I'm a social scientist, not an animal scientist or geneticist, but about these quantitative traits that are kind of an amalgam of these other traits that make it more difficult to parcel out. And I thought that's exactly what we're trying to do with our theoretical frameworks here. We're trying to tease out these causal mechanisms, measure them so that we can go on to influence and predict them. So some quick examples of evidence-based communication, because you know what they say about assuming, that it makes you waste a lot of resources. And even more than wasting resources, we risk what we call the backfire effect. Talked about trust being difficult to build and easy to break. When we have an initial first interaction with someone around this space, because it is so culturally loaded in the United States, we really can do more harm than good if we don't proceed with caution and really get to know our audience. So this is just a visualization. This is with the American public, not cattle producers specifically, and more broadly in climate support. And so this is just we measured their agreement with the scientific consensus, primarily that anthropogenic human causal piece, their trust in science, again, trust is a major player, their trust in the media, because most individual Americans hear about climate change through the media. And this was a Texas-based population. So it's a little bit more conservative leaning, but we can see that we have polar opposites on each end, just as you would expect, but we also have this majorly moderate group in the middle, who I'm just wanting to show to represent that movable middle piece there. And then maybe more relevant to our discussions today, and certainly complementing the conversation that Jamie brought up for us this morning, is when we're talking about climate-smart beef production communication. Will consumers in the United States pay for this? Is there an interest? We did some audience segmentation with these audiences, and we see our two smaller groups here. This would be on the far right-hand end, and this would be on the far left-hand end, our two smallest groups on the extreme. We're not gonna spend too much time communicating with our group that's primarily vegans. That's not a wise use of our resources as communicators. And then the same ones, specifically thinking of climate-smart beef, we're calling these, there's some kind of punny names here, beef or bust, because they're not concerned with climate. They're already eating beef. They're unlikely to pay that premium for beef produced with that increased production costs. But then we have here what we're calling our prime audiences. That's that movable middle. We see, again, support for that diffusion of innovation framework, with our largest groups being right there in the middle, not totally polarized on either end of the issue. To borrow a phrase from yesterday, some meat on the bone here. For us to work with in that movable, moderate middle, a lot of moderate perceptions in this space. And so I'll just leave with some food for thought for this discussion and for our work as science communicators, is that we must meet our target audiences where they are physically, so meet them at the information sources where they're already getting their information, and then also meet them where they are psychologically, again, risking that backfire effect and cognitive dissonance. And I've talked about tailoring and targeting, and I'll leave you with this handy-dandy phrase to keep in your back pocket. We call it the WIFM principle. It's very relevant when we're working with funders in this climate-smart space right now, is the what's in it for me. When we're working with investors, with collaborators, when I'm recruiting participants, when I'm trying to bring farmers into the table to discuss, really highlighting what we've been calling those co-benefits, the motivations they have to engage in these conversations. And then I'll end with a couple of photos. It's been a blast to get one foot back on the operation and keep one foot in higher ed. So looking forward to the discussion today. Thank you.